Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. One of the things about being in radio so long is you get to meet so many other newscasters who are just downright interesting or funny. One of them is Michael Collins, who, like a lot of us in radio, grew up in the Midwest.
Born and raised in Detroit. Lived there up until I went to college. Detroit proper, far out Detroit, right by the suburbs, but I'm a Detroit kid.
What was Detroit like those decades ago? I mean, now you mention the word Detroit to people, they panic.
It was a great place to live. It was a great middle-class neighborhood. When I was born in the late 40s, right after the war, Detroit had the highest average household income in the world.
Really?
Everybody wanted to live in Detroit. It was a manufacturing center. It was, the industrial standard for the world. And there was hardly any vacancy. People were coming into Detroit to make cars and work in factories, and as a result, people had money. And it was a Leave It to Beaver neighborhood, lots of trees, lots of friends, never locked our door, all of that, Detroit.
Yeah. Very much, except not urban, where I grew up in southern Indiana. We never locked anything except when we went away on vacation. And
exactly the same story here.
Locked it up. Yeah. On this show, on a previous episode, I interviewed an inner city minister who has been helping people in Detroit about 30 years now. And he's about 10 years younger than you and I. And even at that age, he just cried about how the city he used to love isn't there anymore.
It's really sad. I go back 2 or 3 times a year. I was just back a month or two ago, and I can show you pictures that I took on my cell phone of some of the houses and some of the buildings that I grew up in and around. And my aunt had this beautiful colonial home on a street called Beaconsfield. It's empty and abandoned, and just kind of shocking. For some reason, and not that I have anything to do with it, but the house I was born and raised in is still looking pretty good. Whoever the people are who live there now, they've kept it up for some reason.
You know, the house where I lived from the time I was 30 until I moved away, at the time I was 3 until I moved away from home at 30, is a daycare center now. So it's being taken care of, but they've added onto the side of the roof, and I drove down the alley the last time I was home, which was about 4 or 5 years ago for my mother's funeral. And I stopped there and I looked at the tree, it's been trimmed back, and I looked up at my old window and I said, Dennis, you really got to get out of here. You got to move on. Because I was almost overcome by the fact. And I had this funny thought, they didn't ask my permission to do this. And then I said, no, you moved away, you left it. But nothing stays the same, but by the same token, your heart is in a place like that. It isn't as if, you lived in Detroit for 6 months. And speaking of sirens in the background now. But one of the things the minister told me was the fact that many neighborhoods now, which have become completely vacant, rather than let them become crack houses or flop houses, they're tearing the neighborhoods down now.
Whole swaths of neighborhood have gone. And they're talking about urban farming. They're allowing people, let's say you have the one home on that city block. They're allowing the people to buy the land on each side of the home that used to have houses on them, to buy these properties for $200 a piece. So lots of people are picking up these properties, and there's plenty of land. There's also a lot of talk that there's a artiste community developing there, and that it's drawing in people who are avant-garde, who are in the art world in some way, shape, or form, and that it's really developing a community. It's got a long way to go, but all the power to them. And I'm a Detroit booster just because Detroit is hardwired in my brain.
Sure.
I mean,
and I want to get into you loving radio, but one more thing, and I don't mean to make this a Let's Trash Detroit hour, but the sad thing about the deterioration is my memories of Detroit, and I never got downtown, only got to the airports, but I went north on assignment a lot. I got up to Flint, which is a lovely middle-sized community that also went to hell in a handbasket. Yeah. In many ways, a better microcosm than Detroit is as far as decay. Yeah. But there are some wonderful suburbs on the north side, and they call it Mile 2, Mile 3, Mile 4 road up there. And there's a wonderful city. About how far away is Frankenmuth? Hour and a half? 2 hours?
About an hour and a half, yeah.
They celebrate Christmas all year round. It's the damnedest place I've ever been in my life.
I knew the family who owned the place.
Bronner's,
wasn't it? Yeah, and they had fried chicken. I've done stories up there several times. The guy who was the patriarch, he's gone now, but we kind of took a liking to each other. He was funny on the air, and I would go up there for little television segments occasionally and would have fun with them. And they also owned a couple of restaurants, big into fried chicken up there as well.
The big thing was to go up on Sunday and have fried chicken there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I will not tell you the story about how deathly ill I got after eating up there once. But I loved going up there. I remember, to me, the fun thing about going to Detroit was finding enough time in the assignment to run up to Frankenmuth, which is only, about 10,000 people, something like that?
Yeah, small little German enclave originally. And I used to go to a Lutheran German Lutheran summer camp right near there, and it was all kids from Frankenmuth.
Yeah. Well, those little enclaves, whether they're in an urban area or they're a city by themselves that are ethnic, are so much fun. New Braunfels, Texas, is German. Very near my hometown in Indiana, there's a city that does not have a German name, Jasper, Indiana, which holds the distinction of being the first city in the U.S. to require everyone to have a garbage disposal. It's on the sign as you come into town.
Is that right?
But I can remember my dad, who was with Montgomery Ward, that venerable company, would go down to Jasper to sell plumbing and heating, and there was always a local guy who'd go with him, and all the guys that were from Jasper. When I was about 10, 11, they all had that thick accent. And the thing that shows you how wonderful America is, the city Jasper, which is English word? It's not German, certainly, I wouldn't think.
No.
Is in a county, Dubois. Dubois.
Yeah.
But it's pronounced Dubois.
Yeah.
Okay? The second biggest city that's all German in Dubois County is named Ireland. And they have a huge St. Patrick's Day festival where everyone has a German accent. It's just... That in itself, the network should have done a story on that. I don't think they ever have. When you were growing up, I know WJR in Detroit was a big influence on a lot of people, and WXYZ in Detroit is where the Lone Ranger, Green Hornet, and Sergeant Preston came out of. So as far as a radio heritage, Detroit was not a bad place. And then you had the stations across in Windsor in Canada.
Again, there was a lot of money in Detroit, so there was a lot of advertising dollars. And there's some preeminent radio stations that really transformed into television stations in the late 40s. WXYZ. WJR had applied for a television license, and for some reason they decided to pass on it at the last minute.
Wow. In the beginning,
WWJ, the first...
That's the one I forgot, yes.
Arguably the first commercial radio station in the world.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've got those stations up there. I'm not sure how much older or younger than you are than I am, but we're near the same age, I think. Did you have television early as a child? Because we didn't. We were out in rural Indiana. And although my dad was able to get a TV because he was with Montgomery Ward, I think I was 6 or so before I saw television for the first time. But yet people in the major markets I talked to, particularly New York and L.A., they had television, even if it were only 1 or 2 stations, very early.
I guess we didn't have television until I was like 3 or 4, although I don't remember my life without a television set there.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But I think it was not so much that I was that old, it was that we were in a non-TV area
that could be.
at the time.
Right. Yeah.
Were you artistic as a child? Because you're a heck of a writer now, and you express yourself phenomenally well. Were you shy? Were you outgoing? Do you remember?
I never. No, I don't. I think. Well, I was always a geek. I was into music. I kind of liked to perform, and I remember one time when I was a kid. My grades were always B's, C's. I was a few A's here and there. But my mother once heard her on the phone going, "Michael's very studious," and I went, "What? Who?
Yeah.
Me?
You sound like me. I was succeeding without studying. I was content not to flunk. That was my goal.
I did like to read at an early age. I for some reason, I picked up my mother's love of books. I remember a couple times I was determined to read the entire newspaper from cover to cover, just because I thought, well, all this is information. It's here
in one day.
Oh yeah, well, I didn't know any better, and then that only lasted maybe a day.
Just be glad you didn't live in New York.
And then I learned how to edit my reading. I didn't care about recipes.
Yeah, that's something that would really bore people. But one of the things I don't think the casual listener knows is that quite often in radio, particularly local radio, not network, and I say that because at the network level, you pretty well have to have the script timed out. But at the local level, sometimes you just throw a bunch of news in a bucket and start reading, watch the clock. Sometimes you have to come out to the second when you're done.
Oh, yeah.
But you go through a story, and sometimes you're reading 4 or 5 lines ahead, and you throw out this sentence and move that element, and it's an acquired ability. But editing as you read is interesting.
Oh, it was interesting that you wrote a story today on the guy who smashed his car into
the door of a casino. Yes.
And it was written so well. I just took out, cross this out, move it from here to here. Instead of acknowledging the police report, I just said, police said. But that's our different styles. But it was written so well, it was just, I could have rewritten it, but no, I'll just cross this out.
I bloat when I write sometimes. That's the problem. But then you're right. If you have the ability to shorten as you read, it's kind of a miracle ability.
Well, I have to do it ahead of time. I have to use a pencil
But pencils have erasers.
Yeah.
That's
right.
good thing.
Okay.
So you like music and you like reading. What did your school have a radio club, or were you hanging around radio stations?
No. I did start listening to the radio, disc jockeys on WXYZ. I guess when I started listening to rock music and watching American Bandstand, but I was from an environment where you wouldn't tell people, God, I'd really like to be a disc jockey. They'd go, oh, that is so stupid. My environment, nobody would think about being on the air or anything like. We were all going to be teachers, I think, or my father was a CPA, so we might go into math. But
well, it's kind of like the old days when you were ashamed to tell your parents if you wanted to go into My God theater.
Oh, well, that when I got to college and they did have theater groups and put on presentations, I didn't have the guts to even go there, even though I guess deep down I really wanted to do it. But
it sounds as if it's tradition and also parental aspirations in a way. Or were you just policing yourself, doing what you think you should do?
I guess that's it. I don't know. I'm verbalizing this.
Yeah, but you might have been a completely different person if you'd gone out for theater.
Oh, I know.
You might be in New York now or something.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, eventually, you're going to get on television, and eventually you're going to get on radio. When did you first do any of that?
In high school, there were the guys who read the PA announcements. And I started hanging out with one of those guys. And he said, well, come on. Try. I tried it once, and then I walked back to the classroom, and all my buddies were sitting there, and they started laughing. So I never did that again. But I kind of kept hanging out with the guy who did it, he's like a year or so, another class. And he picked up a job at a little radio station, and I would go with him, just Sunday afternoons. And I would go with him, and I became fascinated by it. And then when I went to college, they had a campus radio station.
And where was that?
Ferris State College. Back then, it's now a university, but it wasn't back then. And I got on the campus. I'm away from home. I'm left to my own devices, so I applied.
Your old friends aren't there to laugh at you.
Applied for campus. For the campus radio station, and it worked. And from there, after maybe a couple of years, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is about an hour away, there was a big radio station for Grand Rapids. It was the big station, WLAV. And I'd heard there was an opening. I made a tape in the campus radio station, took it down there. A guy by the name of Dick McKay was the program director. And he played it, and it was awful. I think the only reason he hired me was because I was the first guy to come in there with short hair. I didn't have... I still was holding on to that clean-cut look.
Yeah, right. And going to that Lutheran summer camp.
And I was pretty god-awful. Actually, I mean, I was never very good as a disc jockey, but I was able to make my way and pull it off. I did that for... out of college, I got offered a job in Denver. And from there, I went to Cleveland. And from there, someone at the ABC FM station in Detroit, the sister station of WXYZ, heard me driving through Cleveland and sent me a letter. I was driving through, I worked for WRIF, the ABC-owned FM station in Detroit. If you're interested, call me. Well, I called him up and said, I was born and raised there, I know. And he said, you know what? There was something about you that sounded Detroit. And I don't know what it was. I was just doing what I did. But I think, you pick up little mannerisms of the people you listen to as a kid, whether you know it or not. Mm-hmm. And, they hired me, and I ended up being the morning man on WRIF for 4 years, and then I was fired.
Weren't we all?
And within 3 months, the AM side, WXYZ, had just gone talk. And because I was doing mornings, I used to do a lot of interviews on this FM show. So they hired me on WXYZ, this talk station. I'd never really done talk before. I did it. This was, pre-Rush Limbaugh. You didn't have to be that confrontational back then. And I did that for another 3 years. And while I was there, there was also a television station, and you got to interact to some extent with the people who were on television and see them in the hall. And I can do that. I mentioned it to my sports guy. He was well known around the state. I said, I'd really like to try television. He said, well, why didn't you tell me? He knew the owner of a television station in Lansing, WJIM, and I went up there and did an audition, and they hired me to be an anchor right off the bat.
You had never done that on TV?
Never.
No. Before you talk about your commute, I was going to say that one of the interesting things about radio is that when you're on the air, anybody, any prospective employer might hear you. And the great story is that when Ralph Edwards was looking for a replacement to take over for him on Truth or Consequences, he's driving across L.A., and he happens to tune to this little radio station. I think it was a Burbank or Glendale.
Who was it?
No, and he heard this guy. He told his daughters, find out who this is. It was Bob Barker.
Bob Barker.
He calls him up. He
right.
said, can you get down here? Barker was there in 18 minutes, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
If he had tuned to a different station, I mean, there's so many ifs there. But that's the thing about it. You never know who's listening.
That's true.
So how far is the commute, Detroit-Lansing?
It's about an hour and a half.
Okay.
And,
so you're spending 90 minutes a day in a car commuting. But you're also anchoring on television.
That's right. Eventually, the anchoring thing, I cut back and I was only doing talk radio on the weekends because I just couldn't do it every day. I tried. And less money, much less money at this little television station than the radio paid. But they were nice enough to keep me around to do weekend shows. And between the two...
But originally, you're trying to do TV and radio.
At the same time.
At the same time in two cities an hour and a half apart.
Yes.
Nutsy. Or gutsy, maybe I should say.
I had no friends. I had no social life. But I didn't care. I was driven.
And you were making money.
And I was making money. Yeah.
Wow. But they still kept you on a couple of days a week in Detroit.
Yeah. And eventually it became a Sunday night show from 10 at night till 2 in the morning called Night Call. And it was just me and, boy, listen to me waving my flags and showing off here. But when I left both of those stations to go to Cincinnati, the program director, a guy by the name of Fred Jacobs, sent out a memo, and I had not known this, saying that for the last year, this is the #1 radio show in the city.
And they hadn't told you?
Yeah, no. I was never around because I was up in Lansing. I didn't get there during office hours. Oh. And, 10 at night till 2 in the morning on a Sunday night, it's not a huge audience, but I can still say we were the #1 rated show, total demos, total adults in the city.
Good for you.
Yeah.
The thing about big city talk radio is, with few exceptions, you were talking about it being non-confrontational. The large stations, let's pick WWL in New Orleans, 50,000 watts, pick it up in 2/3 of the U.S. I always told people they used to talk about shrimp and the New Orleans Saints. That there was never anything in your face. WSB in Atlanta was like that. Well, and you listen, and there was a time when talk was a lot more gentle and just as interesting.
There was, there was debate, and we could get loud, and I had my detractors, people who thought I was a little too liberal, but it certainly isn't like it is now. And the other thing, I think, I'm not sure if I'd be much better at it today. I didn't have the information stream that they now have. I couldn't Google search everything. I had to read 2 or 3 newspapers, and that was all I had. The local newspapers and maybe the Washington Post, the New York Times. That was all the information I could get my hands on to talk about the topics of the day way back then.
I think people would be surprised if they could watch a lot of radio talk hosts sitting there quietly on their computer, coming up with background information that sounds as if it's off the top of their head. You're right. It's so easy now when you get... Somebody would mention former Illinois Governor Otto Kerner. Well, you go to Google and it says, he, if I remember right, let's see, he was governor first. And, you sound like a Rhodes Scholar, but a lot of that now you can suck in off the internet within seconds.
Which you couldn't then.
No. So how long, you then get to Cincinnati, and I want to tell you that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Cincinnati because I have a special love of that city. I grew up 3 hours away in Indiana. My mom had a sister there, and they were pretty well off. And I used to go over there a couple times a year and spend a week. And I was, I guess, not in 8th grade yet, the first time I went over there. And I think listening to Cincinnati radio, and particularly watching WLW television, which was kind of the gold standard in the Midwest, started my love of broadcasting. And there's a woman I want to talk about in a little bit who was on there. But how did you get that invitation? They heard you and said, come to Detroit. Did somebody hear you, or had you put out feelers?
I had a friend who there was a sportscaster in Detroit growing up by the name of Ray Lane on Channel 2. He did the Tigers, he did the Lions. He was this incredible sportscaster. And I knew his son and his daughter. Ray Lane ended up doing the play-by-play for the Cincinnati Reds. And the son was about my age, and so he would go down there, and he was an attorney, and he was wanted to see if he could become an agent. So he thought he would test the waters with me. So Ray Lane's son went to the general manager of WLW with a tape that I'd made in Lansing, and they hired me. And that's
well,
how
and
it happened.
I think what we need to tell people at this point is that the depth of talent in Cincinnati at that time. I remember a guy, you may know who I'm thinking of, with a very weird last name, Al Shuttlecotty.
He was the main newsman on Channel 9. Wow. Al Shuttlecotty. Yeah. His brother was a sports reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. Al did television. His brother did sports for the newspaper. And my friend was the son of the sports guy.
What a well-connected family in the media.
Boy,
you're not kidding.
Mm-hmm. The name is magic in that town, or it was at that time.
I have never seen photos, but I have been told that the broadcast complex of WLW in Cincinnati was a pretty phenomenal building. Because at least somebody said that they were just blown away when they saw it. Of course, its heritage goes back. At one time, it was the only radio station on 700 on the dial during certain parts of the day, and you could pick it up halfway around the world.
They had 500,000 watts for a period of time. Yeah, Powell Crosley, the guy who came up with Crosley Electronics, Crosley Radios. There was a Crosley vehicle for a period of time. Powell Crosley Jr. Grabbed a hold of broadcasting, was selling radios, and he needed a vehicle, a reason for people to buy these radios. So he came up with WLW, and he got to know Roosevelt, and this was during the war, and he's the one who said, maybe we should have a station that's 500,000 watts, so in case something happens, we can
cover
broadcast,
the country
everywhere. And the rumor has it that the transmitter was in Mason, Ohio, for this 500,000 watt radio station, and they say all the wire fences on all the farms, you could hear WLW through the wires.
They acted as antennae, I guess.
Yeah,
and I have seen pictures of the transmitter because they had to surround the tubes with water to cool them. It was a tremendous operation, yeah. I mentioned there was a woman in Cincinnati. Here I am, 7th, 8th grade kid, watching television. My aunt and uncle had a color TV. We didn't. And there was a woman who I guess had dominated Cincinnati broadcasting since the radio days, and her name was Ruth Lyons.
30s.
How would you describe, or explain, maybe be a better word, Ruth Lyons to somebody who's never heard of her?
They called her mother. By the time I'd gotten there, she was still alive, but she retired. The remnants, some of the people from the remnants of her empire were still working there. Her hand-selected replacement was a guy by the name of Bob Braun. His show was still on the air. They called the studio that you were talking about before, the house that Ruth built. In the early 50s, it was on both radio and television. Willie Thal was the name of... Didn't you ask me?
Yeah, you showed me a picture of her with this dark-haired guy beside her, and I said, was that the husband? And you say no.
It just occurred to me his name was Willie Thal, Thall.
Was he an executive there?
No, he was her co-host.
Oh, okay. I guess she was such a dominant character. I don't remember him.
Well, she really knew how to play off people, and he was her partner on the show for many years, and they both could sing, they both could ad-lib, they both could interview, they both could do live commercials. And at some point, WKRC, the ABC affiliate at the time, tried hiring Willie away and gave him his own show, and it didn't go anywhere, and Ruth continued to trudge on with someone else as a partner. Peter Grant became her partner. Peter Grant was another big news name in early Cincinnati
and he
television.
Was suave.
Yeah.
He looked like a British actor, if I remember.
Yeah.
Dark. Did he have a mustache?
They say his voice was very much like Roosevelt.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh. So they've got the show, and then Crosley was very smart. He formed a network, and the show was seen live not only on Cincinnati, but Dayton, Columbus, Indianapolis.
Dayton, Columbus, Indianapolis. Did I say Columbus?
Yes. Did it go to Cleveland?
No. The show was broadcast in Cleveland, but it wasn't a Crosley-owned company.
Okay. But it was largely that Indiana, Ohio pocket there, northern Kentucky also.
And, and with that, they started something called the Phil Donahue Show.
Oh, yes.
Out of WLWD in Dayton. It was WLWT, the television station in Cincinnati, WLWC in Columbus.
WLWI
in
Indianapolis. Yeah. Neat.
Yeah.
That's back when you could have fun call letters. So Ruth Lyons did the show, if you combine radio and TV, 35, 40 years maybe she dominated the Cincinnati market?
I have at home, and I'll bring it in if you haven't seen it. A friend of mine from Cincinnati did a documentary on Ruth Lyons. Have I told you about it? Have you seen it?
I have not seen
it
yet. No.
Okay. Well, I'll bring it in. It's
because
really
I just
pretty
know
good.
that she was very important in my childhood.
Yeah. Well, this has all the clips. It's great.
She was a non-pretentious, not a Hollywood star type person. Had kind of a rough voice in a way, but she dominated the camera.
Yeah. There was also she also came on the air. In this documentary, I've got.
I want to see it.
She really stood up for integration at a time when it wasn't talked about, and I wish I could remember the anecdote, and I can't. But I think it was Phil Donahue who talked about how she really was ahead of her time in a lot of ways, and she wasn't afraid to occasionally let people know where she was coming from politically.
My guest this time around is fellow broadcaster Michael Collins. He spent a lot of his career in the Midwest and a dozen years or so in Cincinnati. Now, as we've been talking about, Cincinnati is a great radio city. Some wonderful talent came from there. Two people named Clooney, Rosemary Clooney, and, of course, the nephew, George Clooney, the actor, producer, director, but also George's father, Rosemary's brother, did TV news for years, and famously.
Nick Clooney. When I got to Cincinnati, I was at the NBC station, and Nick was at the he owned the ABC, owned the market at WKRC, Channel 12. He was, what a great communicator. He was so good. And so one-on-one, it was almost like he was reaching out of the screen and pulling you in the way he told stories. He also was one of those anchors who went out and covered stories. And so the public got to see him, and he was writing his own stuff, putting it on the air every night. And he was there for the first few years I was there. And then he was offered a job at KNBC in Los Angeles, so he left town. And it was during that period of time that the station I was working for, WLW, we took over the ratings. We had an anchor by the name of Jerry Springer, who had never done television before, but he was
vice mayor or something.
He was a folk hero in Cincinnati, and a hell of a writer. He wrote these commentaries, The Closing Thought. Mm-hmm. He was doing these every night, and while Nick was gone, we shot up to number one. And when Nick came back, they tried it again, but we were on a roll. NBC was on a roll as well, so we benefited from things like The Cosby Show and Miami Vice. And
I can imagine managing a television station, and no matter what the network, we'll call it Network R, and you see the lineup for the fall, and there's nothing exciting about it, and you're thinking, boy, this is going to be a hard sell. Because instead of the nightly news on the local station following the Cosby Show or All in the Family or something, it's following Jerry and his dog or some lackluster program. I saw a documentary where George Clooney, who pretty well was the driving force behind Good Night and Good Luck, that wonderful movie about Murrow.
Oh, yeah.
Said that he used to hang around his dad as a kid, and he began to love broadcast news because his dad was doing it.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen. I got to know Nick and his wife Nina, and some of their friends. I don't know how, but I ended up at dinner parties with some of these people. I have no idea why, and in the process, I would hear stories about George as a kid all the time. And years later, I'm at the NBC station, and George Clooney was on several NBC shows, several NBC hit sitcoms they would try.
And he came from out of nowhere.
I did a lot of entertainment, and we were a pretty good-sized station. And so you would get calls from the PR people in L.A. saying, hey, George Clooney's going to be home. Why don't you do an interview with him on this show? And I'd always say no, because his father was Nick Clooney from the other station.
From the other TV station.
And so I thought I should say no. And, I'm thinking, to this day, damn it, I could be hanging out with old George in
L.A.
Yeah, had I just not turned my head against it.
So how many years were you in Cincinnati?
12.
12.
Yeah.
I've seen some of your work that you did at remote locations, and that's not easy. I would think some of that, the circumstances, putting that all together with stuff going on.
I kind of loved it. I kind of took to it like water. That somebody once told me that it's easier for a radio person to go to television than it is for a television person to go to radio. Because on radio, and I guess some of that talk, you learn to be spontaneous and just go with whatever's going on. And I also kind of learned how to be prepared. I always had something in my back pocket. So even though it was live and spontaneous, I always knew if this goes wrong, I'll do this. Or if this doesn't happen, I'll say this. So
well, both Steve Allen and Tom Snyder, who started in radio, both of them, in separate interviews, I heard them say that had they not had to fly by the seat of their pants alone on radio and fill all that time, they might not have been as good in television.
Yeah.
So you have a very good point there. You're conditioned to be able to come up with something. May not always be interesting, but you know.
But on the other hand, I've got to say I am so glad they didn't have the kind of software they have today, and they didn't have the internet, and they didn't have, because I screwed up so many. I've saved the good stuff. I've screwed up so many times, it would be all over the world.
That's a very good point, and we don't like to remember the bad times.
Oh God, anyway. I was awful.
I must tell you, I don't think I've told this on the air. My most embarrassing moment in radio. It is 1967, I think, and I'm at the hometown radio station in Indiana, and there was a show on ABC Radio called The Man About Music. It was every night at 6:30. was a guy named Ted Lawrence. And it was a 25-minute big band disc jockey kind of show. It was really had outlived its popularity, but ABC was still feeding it. And it started out, the second hand would come around, and right at 6:30, you'd hear Ted Lawrence say, "Hi again, everybody, it's Ted Lawrence." And the music, it's the man about music. Well, he had taken a 2-week vacation. It was Monday of the 3rd week, and the log said Ted was back.
Yeah.
But he wasn't.
Yeah.
ABC was feeding a special program. I remember the owner and the manager were both out of town. And I'm coming up to 6:30, and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be joining ABC here. And as you know, some time ago, someone left. We haven't heard from them for a while, and I was pretty thrilled when he left." I was being really cocky, right? "I cannot prevent his return. Say hello to everybody." And you hear John Kennedy saying, "And so, my fellow Americans," right? And then this organ music comes up, and then Carl Caruso, who ended up at NBC, in this wonderful voice says, "Commemorating the 4th death anniversary of President John Kennedy, the American Broadcasting Company from St. Patrick's Cathedral presents," and I could have walked out under the door if I just kept my mouth shut. But I said, this guy left. I was thrilled when he left.
Going to be so clever.
Yeah. Clever's a dirty word sometimes. After Cincinnati, what? Is that when you move west?
No. I was offered a job back in my hometown on television in Detroit, and I did. I was the morning anchor on the Fox morning show for 4 years in Detroit.
Getting up how early?
I hated it.
Yeah.
Oh, waking up at. I ended up there at the end in Cincinnati. They were grooming me to anchor the mornings. Some guy from Detroit who I had known in a previous life was the news director, and Detroit, I guess it's my hometown. They pay so much better, and so I'll give it a shot. It didn't go quite as well for me there. Wish I could remember the name. I was there for 4 years.
I'll tell you something. I don't care if I ever have to get up early again. My last gig before coming to Southern California to do news part-time every day it had me getting up at 5:30 in the morning. And when that gig, isn't that funny, in radio and music we say gigs, when that job finally ended, I thought, I am never getting up. I think the only time I ever got up earlier was for my draft physical.
For years after I got off mornings, I was still waking up very early. It took me a few years to I'd sleep in till 7. And all those years did mornings. I'd be on vacation or at somebody's place on the weekends or something, and people are sleeping till 9, 10 in the morning, and I was up at 6 trying to be quiet because I didn't want to wake anybody. My clock was severely damaged for a long time.
Well, and they say, Chris, that wasn't exactly graveyard. But they say that people who work graveyard, and I worked midnight to 8 for 9 years when I was in Washington, that you take years off your life.
Oh, I know.
It's not a healthy thing.
My very first job in radio at WLAB in Grand Rapids was from midnight to 5. And I did that for about a year. And,
and you're going to bed after the sun comes up. No, it's awful.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in D.C., I was at a restaurant, and I have a loud voice. And this guy at the next booth, and in D.C., you either wear a suit and tie or a military uniform. This guy with all these gold things all over, scrambled eggs, they call it, all over his uniform, said, "Are you Dennis Daly?" I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "I hear you doing the news." "Oh, really?" "I hear you on Armed Forces Radio."
Yeah.
Now, we'll say this. Armed Forces Radio carried UPI and Associated Press because we didn't have commercials in them. And they can't carry commercials on Armed Forces Radio. I said, "Oh, what station?" I listen in Tokyo." I said, "Well, wow, boy," because I was doing the news at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. I said, you really must be up odd hours." He said, "No, you're not thinking here. You're prime time in Tokyo. It's afternoon." I thought, wow, I never thought about that. Somebody was actually listening because not everybody was at 2 in the morning. But that is the thing. What did it feel like? I have two questions as we close out. That first time you anchored on television, do you remember then? I mean, most baseball pitchers remember their first pitch in the majors. You go from radio, all of a sudden the lights are on, you're on camera.
You're so swept up by everything that's going on. I don't think you, you think it's kind of cool. It's just like radio. Once you do it every day, you really start taking it for granted, and it's only those little stories when someone will come up to you and recognize you, that you realize, hey, this is really cool. You do realize it's cool, but you do it every day, so you take it for granted.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, it's been a very long time since I've been really nervous on the air.
Oh, yeah.
As a matter of fact, I know when I first started at the station where you and I crossed paths, I was nervous because it was like learning to type on a different typewriter.
Oh, yeah.
The equipment is in a completely different place.
Sure.
But once you get to the point where you can push the buttons without looking, then you can think about what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's a fun place to work, and the process of doing this I really enjoy it. I love writing, and I love keeping up on what's going on, and
I love writing so much that I have fun when I hear someone else read my news scripts.
Except me. And
I didn't say that.
Oh, my God, listen to what
he's butchering what I wrote.
Butchering. Don't you use the word butchering?
Michael Collins, one final question. If you could wave a magic wand and go back to 1 week, was it all both good and bad, or is there one assignment you had that you really miss?
I can just say during that period of time in Cincinnati, there was about 4 or 5 years that, and I think some of the people there will agree with me, that I was on a creative role. I don't know. It all seemed to come together, and they appreciated everything I did, and I was meeting cool people, and there were great news stories going. Pete Rose beating Ty Cobb's record, and then Pete Rose getting kicked out of baseball.
And Marge Schott.
And Marge Schott.
Who owned the Reds.
And Bengals going to the Super Bowl. And the Reds winning the World Series. I mean, and I got to have a ringside seat. Not only have a ringside seat, go backstage for all this. And that period of time was golden for me. Does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. We all have moments like that. You can't dwell on them too much.
No.
But at least you and I both have had more exciting careers than if we'd sold shoes.
Unless you like selling shoes.
Unless you like selling shoes, yes. Michael Collins, thank you. You do excellent work, and I envy some of the assignments you've had, particularly in Cincinnati. I love Cincinnati, but maybe not now. Maybe if I went back now, it wouldn't be the Cincinnati I remember.
Somebody just put something up the other day, and there's this whole crowd on Facebook that we see each other's stuff, and somebody put something up about a guy who was one of the people who helped start the E! Network, who was a writer when I was in Cincinnati, and he put up some pictures of those early days, and I just said, we were so lucky. It was the right time, right place, right people, and it just kind of all came together.
But you can't go back.
That doesn't happen every day.
Reminds me, didn't you do a report one time about the fact that there were no cameramen or something, or there was a strike going on?
Yeah.
As we go out, explain that. It was very inventive.
Let's see. There were several things going on then. One of them I really couldn't talk about. There was a rumor that our photographer union was going to go out on strike. At that time, there was also a baseball strike, a football strike, and there were 3 or 4, a writer's strike in Los Angeles. So I put it together, and I had a nightmare. What if I went and I didn't have a photographer? And so we created this scenario, and the coolest thing is I worked with the mayor. My job was to shoot Mayor Lucan's reaction to Columbus Day.
And pretend that there's no cameraman.
And I would shoot him, and then he would take the camera and shoot me, asking him a question. And the final shot was the camera on the desk, and the two of us on our knees so we could look directly into the camera and do the closing stand-up.
Sounds as if the mayor of Cincinnati was a good sport.
Oh, he loved that story. Yes, we keep in touch just because of that.
Wow. Michael, thank you. A pleasure to know you as a friend and work with you, and thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.